Hey Internet, this is Gunter with MiniMishaps, and today we are talking about using homebrew languages creatively in RPGs. One of my favorite things in the world is languages, and I love linguistics and everything that has to do with learning new languages. So we have a bunch of ways here to creatively use languages as a DM to entertain your players, but also as players to fill out the backstory and make your characters develop and things like that. We have a resource on DriveThru RPG that is the languages of the GetherVerse. It's not comprehensive. There are dozens more than what's listed here, but this is the first installment, and we're just going to go through and kind of talk about how to use them to enjoy your linguistics in D&D even more. So we're just going to do them alphabetically, and we'll start off right with the first one is Amaguan. Amaguan is a pseudo-language, and it is derived from Amara, which is the goddess equivalent of Aphrodite, or the love and romance goddess. The Amaguan is not something that is affecting your charisma-based modifiers at all. It doesn't give you advantage on charisma checks or anything like that. Because it's a language, it can be learned in a language slot. What it does do is it allows two characters, usually bards or performers, they could be spies, people would learn Amaguan for any variety of reasons, but it is trained social responses, and there's some study of cultural interactions and chemistry and things like that. But the two characters that have learned Amaguan in their language slots can communicate almost as if telepathically. They don't need to speak, and there isn't any telepathic projection in terms of something that could be intercepted by somebody that was reading minds. So it's a little bit handy that way if you're facing psionics or people that are mind intrusive to have Amaguan. It tends to go with diplomats and anybody that's going to be working with crowds of people. It just sort of gives them a sense of the crowd and or the individual if they're talking one-on-one. So there's lots of different ways to use it, but it is a pseudo-language that can take the language slot that way. Our next language is a language grouping, and it's Aviani, and there will be a few of these where our animalians in our role-playing universe, there are hundreds of custom races based around every variety of animal, insect, fish, bird, fill in the blank, creature. The Aviani or Aviani language is a language between bird folk races, and it allows Kenkus to speak to Aarakocrans if you're using those standard D&D races, but any bird-based. So this might also be like a substitute for an ancient Egyptian. Maybe the bird-headed gods there would be speaking Aviani. We have our own Erguptian pantheon and language, but to any bird-related humanoid. So this does not allow the Aviani speaking and characters and NPCs to speak to birds. That would be a different kind of magic, and remember the languages here aren't the same as casting a spell or using a class ability. So the languages can make for good communication or bad communication, however the DM sees fit to use it. Next, we've got Bulldorc, which is one of our player favorite custom languages. And Bulldorc, the race, they're essentially orcs, but their heads are bulldog heads. And Bulldorcs have evolved a communication system that is partially combative. So physical punches and strikes are in the linguistic structuring, and so it's kind of a combination of sounds as well as movements and strikes. So Bulldorc is a great one if you're a DM and you want to have a linguistically confusing encounter. The Bulldorcs are often received with surprise and get in a lot of unplanned conflicts especially if they don't know about Common or don't speak Common. But having a homebrew language that is partially interactive physically or kinetically is something that we are pretty proud of to have in our universe. Let's talk about Common a little bit. So Common in most role-playing games is English for English speakers, or German for German speakers, or as out here in the IRL world, it is whatever language that the resources are printed in. But a way that you can use Common creatively is that it has a magic woven into it that allows, in our case, people coming from different universes and different worlds to communicate with each other based on Common having a universal understanding, even though it wouldn't back in the characters' homeworlds. So in the other core fantasy languages, Elven and Gnomish and Dwarven, those can function the same way. If you want to have elves from two different worlds be able to communicate, to have that sort of woven into the fabric of how language works in the universes. So being able to have a Common understood when you travel is sort of an unspoken game mechanic, but it's also could be a story arc of something's breaking down in the universal fabric of language, and suddenly there's a Tower of Babel in reverse situation where everybody's speaking Common and nobody can understand each other. And so we have in the GetherVerse, we have the Sky Portal that pulls people from other worlds, and there is some magic in place that allows elves to speak Elven, and people that would have studied any of those core fantasy languages to be able to speak with other people of the same training with linguistics there, even if the languages are completely different. If a person that knew English and a person that knew Japanese or Russian came to the GetherVerse, they would magically be able to speak to each other even if they couldn't before. So kind of a fun way to use that little thought about linguistic aspect, which is common for considering Common. The DriveThru RPG resource has entries for Dark Elven and Draconic and others, but I'm going to skip over those because to use them creatively is going to be finding ways to connect to the culture of the people that speak it, to have it influence their worship or their magic or their day-to-day lives. And it's such a connected to the world entry that outside of using the GetherVerse as your RPG world, it's going to be personal to the DM and the world that they're creating for the players. So, but just taking those other racial languages and just having them impact some facet of the NPC's day-to-day life is a neat way to use language in that case too. But we're going to just do those brief descriptions, and I'll let you know if there's other languages that we're skipping over. Okay, so Druidic here functions a little bit like Amaguan. It does not speak with animals or plants or anything like that, but it does allow druids to communicate with one another, and it gives them a better understanding of how to compare their natural origin state to any geography that they come across. So that languages, we tried really hard not to have them add or impact stats or numbers or to give advantage. Languages aren't meant to necessarily work that way. They certainly can if that's how you're using them. But in this case, Druidic would be more like guides. If you hire an NPC to show you around, those kinds of interactions and things. Or for druids to speak to one another without sharing out loud what their thoughts are. Next up, we've got Dunobri, and Dunobri is in our universe a ancient form of Dwarven, and but here is more of a stand-in for any archaic version of the language. Is a great way to introduce an immortal character or a long, waking from a long stasis or time traveling or any kind of thing like that. And then you can have it be a sliding scale of how different it is from the current universe, the way they use the languages. So for Dunobri, people that speak Dwarven, there's not enough of Dunobri left in Dwarven for them to understand it, so it's a completely different language. But it comes up, like at archaeological sites and ancient lost temples and tombs, and becomes sort of the language of the archaeologists within those lost Dwarven historical locations. So, but that could be converted into any language could have an archaic ancient form, and that would be known by librarians or historians or people invested in treasure hunting, those kinds of things. For Dwarven and Elven and Draconic and those other ones that we're mostly skipping over, another thing that you can do is have the writing systems appear very different. And so for your own universe, you can create that this language is more runic, or this language has sweeping calligraphy, or there's however you want that to personalize the culture of that part of your universe, your homebrew locations. But we're skipping over Dwarven and Elven. And next up, we've got Frogagog. So in the GetherVerse, we have broad branch languages, and we'll get to in a minute the branch language for Frogagog. But Frogagog is specifically frog people and toad people, but doesn't include other reptiles and amphibians, which would be Herpetode would be a universal language for all reptiles and amphibians. But Frogagog is our, any of the RPGs have names for their frog languages. Frogagog can also be a linguistic confusion interaction for your players, in that in the case of Gripply and other frog-based races, they would call their language Gripply, and a Frogagog from the GetherVerse would call their language Frogagog. And so that could be even though the language would be the same, it would be called something different, is also a possibility for a type of linguistic interaction. Alright, skipping over Giantish, Gnomish, and Goblin, and we'll skip over Halpard. Halpard is halflings, or hobbits, those kinds of linguistics, but the languages use is the same as the other races, that you can tie it to whatever your homebrew versions of the cultures are, and that's a way to customize it. So Herbani or Herbani is next, and that is the language of plant folk. Now again, not a speak with plants, which would be a spell or a class ability, but Herbani would be tree folk and leshy, and you can include mushroom-based people in there as well. Sort of like English would use Latin for its scientific terms and medical terms, Herbani has tons of words for things that common doesn't. Parts of plants and types of plant strengths and interactions, and water content and poison and things. They all would have jargon or extensive language needs beyond what common has. Sort of like the Eskimo idea of having several different words for how snow is that we don't have in English. The Herbani would have that for all the plant related. And if you do a lot with your players for spell components or harvesting or recipes with plants or any of that kind of resource navigating, the Herbani is a good one for the people that are in the know on plants. Talked a little bit about Herpetode earlier. Herpetode includes any of the reptilian races, lizard folk. It includes Saurian, so dinosaur language, as well as the Frogagog and other reptile and amphibian humanoid languages. So Herpetode is a magically universal language, even though those other languages are radically different from one another. The Herpetode somehow magically is able to allow them to communicate between each other. So this is a good way to have a Saurian or a dinosaur character be able to speak with another Herpetode speaking person, and skip over the party if the party doesn't speak the languages, but you want two different NPCs from two different reptile races to be able to communicate. So this would be the same for turtles, same for Wanti. It's an all crocodilian in our homebrew system. It's an all reptiles, all amphibians, humanoid languages. Again, another one doesn't allow us to speak with animals, so you're not actually talking to those reptiles and amphibians, just the humanoids. Alright, so we have got Hinterblyre next, and Hinterblyre are our dark Halpards, and Halpards, remember, are halflings. So these are dark halflings, which don't appear real commonly in RPG resources, but Hinterblyre being our representative language for different language systems that grow out of different ecological geographies. So being underground, affecting the language that way, where you may have a different use of facial expressions, or you may have a different way to convey sarcasm or intonation, or the Hinterblyre being totally different on principle maybe than the regular Halpard And that can include, if you wanted to have temperature elements in the linguistic thing, that is a thing that could happen with a regional, locational based language like that. So you could have contexts of lighting that are impossible to replicate without magic. Like underground, you would have things that were incandescent or luminescent, and so those could be integrated into a language system as well. We have Holifyre, or Holifyre if you prefer, but Holifyre is our language of the celestials and angels and cosmic beings of light. It is a light-based language, so it requires the ability to create light. Now, a person can learn how to do that with magic, or they can purchase magical items that allow them to create the light needed to do that celestial language. But essentially, for the Holifyre, you need a light source to do the language itself. We are up to Mech. So Mech is a loose word in the GetherVerse for anything that is technology or mechanical based, steampunk, a lot of that stuff. So Mech, it could be computers and sci-fi and futuristic. Mech here is a universal language for those kinds of humanoids. So it would be for androids and constructs, for any kind of bionic based creatures. There's a programming element to it, so programming that can come to life. Programs can be sentient. AI, all of that would use Mech as a language. And there are magic items that can interact with Mech-speaking characters. But essentially, it's a technology programming-based language that can apply to machines or computers or any of those kinds of cultures as well. Another player favorite is our Mezygmy hand signaling. So the Mezygmies originally were created to be the guardians of the Hungry Dark planar prison. The Hungry Dark is a matter-consuming blob of nanites, and the Mezygmies were created without vocal cords so that they wouldn't be able to be corrupted as casters. They eventually developed the ability to cast without speaking, but their hand signaling is used in the Mezygmy jungle, and it's a way to have sign language be universal for everybody in an area, and so it's also a non-audible language. So, like the other ones that are purely visual, allows communication without needing that audible sounds. So, for the Helphard sneaks that are communicating, or for people that are hunting, that are trying to communicate without giving away their location, the Mezygmy's hand sign is a pretty popular one for that. And they're tiny and they're indestructible, but their language is used in a lot of different capacities. So, and I love languages that use more than vocal components. It's probably the reason for this whole resource that we created is to take language beyond what it normally does. So using visual things like hand signs, or kinetic things like the Bulldorcs, or light, or chemicals if you're a plant, things like those, with language just really is intriguing and exciting as a person that uses an auditory language mainly. Okay, we have Mortim up next. Mortim, the language, Mortim if you prefer, is the language of the dead. Now this is not communicate with dead, this is not animate dead, this is not pull a soul back from Hades and have a jam session. This is only for undead and dead things that function already in the world. So this might be for spirit you encounter, or ghast, or shade, or something that might not otherwise be able to communicate with common, does have Mortim as a universal language. So that is any dead thing or undead thing that does have a presence or a personality in the universe. So a little bit abstract, but could also be, if you have a Hades or a Land of the Dead part of your universe, it could be a language that was used there by the residents there. Alright, Nitehorn is our demons, devils, and all of the other hellish, fiendish inhabitants. But the language is, the language of Nitehorn is actually inverse of the language of the Celestials, so it's opposite Holifyre. Its symbols are written upside down and created with the absence of light or shadow, but they're created at the same time in opposite, because the GetherVerse has a cycle of apocalypses where essentially the world grows too powerful and the gods pit the angels and demons against one another to essentially have the world be destroyed in that cosmic war. And that's a cycle that repeats. So the angels and the celestials and the devils and demons were all created by the gods to fight each other. It's a balancing force. But that means their languages were also created as kind of equal and opposite versions of one another. And in the current version of the GetherVerse, there actually isn't this function. There aren't celestials or demons and devils naturally occurring in the GetherVerse, because the last time the world was destroyed, the heroes found out the plans of how, when, why the apocalypse was happening, and they convinced the angels and demons to have a ceasefire and join forces against the gods. So that ended with there being no angels and demons, and ended up with the whole pantheon of gods being depowered. And it means that the current universe is still, people are still figuring out how it's operating. But linguistically, the Nitehorn and Holifyre are balanced opposites of one another. So Orcish has a listing, and we're going to skip over it like the others. The only side note here is that Bulldorcish was grown out of the Orcish language with the 1,000 years that it was separated from the other orcs on the Neocap. So we have now sort of an evolutionary component of the language, to the point where Orcish and Bulldorcish have no more connection, and they're completely separate languages. Polyglot might be my personal favorite, and this is another pseudo-language, but this ability, or this pseudo-language, is actually the ability to take in new languages, and for the people that utilize it well, it allows them to have basic understanding in real time for languages that they don't otherwise understand. So this is not a transfer of vocabulary necessarily, but it allows them to quickly figure out the grammatical structures and the things that are being made important and emphasized, and how the language is being used. And it can tell the person that has Polyglot in their language slot a ton about a culture or a people or a person's personality just from how they use language. So it is up to, obviously, the DM that whether this pseudo-language allows other languages to be learned faster or unlock over time, as sort of a way that your pseudo-language Polyglot would take up a slot early, and then but eventually probably allow you to learn more languages than otherwise your racing class decisions did at the beginning. So that's Polyglot, and we have a couple of really fun NPCs in the GetherVerse that are polyglots. And if you're just learning that word for the first time, it's a person that speaks lots of languages. Saurian is another language that its root language is Herpetode, but it's the language of the dinosaur humanoids. The only difference in this one is Saurian has a longer history than the core races as a homebrew element of this universe. So following the idea that there were some sort of dinosaur residents in a lost city or Atlantis, under the crust of the world kind of a scenario before there were humans and elves and dwarves, etc. And in the case of the GetherVerse, again, it is that the Saurians inhabited the world more than 4 apocalypses ago. So 4 iterations of the world, the Saurians were hanging out in that sort of primordial high fantasy version of the world. The GetherVerse also has its own version of Thieves' Cant. We call it Thievish. I know it's a very creative name for the language. But essentially it is rogues, sometimes bards and pirates and things have Thievish as a or merchants have it as a way of communicating without the involvement of local authorities, etc. Wobblemur is the next language that's up in the resource, and Wobblemur is a completely unique homebrew race in the GetherVerse. They are anthropomorphic ii, and if you don't know what an ii is, I encourage you to look up the YouTube video True Facts About the ii. It's spelled AI, and that's that whole series by Zafrank is very entertaining. But Wobblemur here, they are ugly cute kind of creatures, and their language, they actually have extra eyelids that are used in their linguistics. So very difficult language for other people to learn, much less be able to replicate, because it takes either illusionary magic or some sort of artificer made artificial eyelids to be able to utilize that that language filling. So, but Wobblemur, if again, check out that II. Even if you just Google search images, it's a fun looking weird creature out here in the real world. All right, last but not least, we've got Yeti, and so the Yeti language in the GetherVerse is used in volume stages. So you have different uses of the language have different sets of vocabulary and grammar. So they have for lack of a better term, they have an inside voice, they have an outside voice, and then they have a yell across, roar across long distance from the mountaintops to other mountaintops communication as part of that as well. And the loudest version to a untrained ear doesn't sound different than the howling of the mountains with high winds. So that is sort of a defense mechanism of using such a volume with language, is that it doesn't give away the Yeti's location unless it's to a person that is trained to recognize the difference between general thundering that are made by mountains and wind and avalanches versus the Yeti's communication by their yell speaking. That is the whole Languages of Gether resource review. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you use languages and linguistics in your games. Let us know how you like to use languages, or if you have a homebrew language or race that uses language differently. Would love to hear those bits. And again, if you enjoy our content, feel free to support us on Patreon or buy me a coffee. And that's it. We'll see you guys next time. Thank you so much.